Okay, welcome to a channel first for the Colonial Pride Review. This is my first time going live, and I'm very proud to welcome a special guest, Clossington, fellow history YouTuber. You should get a link to his channel in the description below. And today we're going to be talking about Freemasonry. Now, Freemasonry is a subject that I am by no means an expert in, but I saw Clossington showing a lot of information about this on X, and so I decided to invite him to come on. We're going to talk about Freemasonry, particularly in colonial America. Clossington, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I've had a sort of smaller, YouTube channel over the last few years, but over the last year, I've gone back into the sort of streaming game. I started off by, just I have a certain passion for building, model ships and discussing various history topics with my various Twitter mutuals, and recently I've been reviewing the various Sharp miniseries movies with all sorts of guests and friends, and uh, having a generally good time. As far as content output, a few years back I wrote for the Old Glory Club's Substack an article called "The Owl and the Eye," which is a sort of long form blog post on the history of the rise and fall of the Bavarian Illuminati and its various connections to, I guess, sort of schizo survival theories and the general history of Freemasonry. And as a rather into the weeds kind of Freemason myself, I have a certain perspective of the actual institution historically and uh, as it exists today. So I prepared a significant amount of sort of research on its overall history and specifically how it relates to colonial history for you. So glad to be here. Overall fan of the Colonial Pride Review YouTube channel, and it's a privilege.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on and bringing your expertise on the subject matter. And what I'm particularly interested in is something you mentioned. You mentioned how there's a lot of, I think it was what you schizoid content about the Freemasons. There's so much sensationalist content about Freemasonry on the internet that has always actually put me off going for my own deep dive. Like I just put off a little bit by the tone in which way it's presented. I just want some straight value-free history. If I later want to decide that Freemasonry is a
Sure.
terrible thing and it should be driven out of society, I mean that can come next. Let's have some knowledge first, right?
Y-
And I'm
mhm.
not start. I don't want to start from that kind of negative premise. In fact, my experience in studying a history is that if you approach something with the assumption that this group is pure evil or out to undermine society, you often fail to understand that group. And my experience actually is in studying all manner of groups in history. The more I study them, the more I come to respect them and what they are, even if I don't necessarily want to be part of it. That applies to all sorts of historical contexts.
Yeah,
And I
sure. There's a lot of particular baggage though with Masonry, as I think the most condemned institution by the Catholic Church, um, you know, still banned in all sorts of countries across the third world, across China and a few other countries, like to this very day. Um, Being a Mason's a mortal sin for Catholics, and it's you know, prohibited for um, membership's prohibited in the Orthodox Church and most evangelical churches. So you you're going to have a very hard time finding sort of charitable defenders on one side, and on the other there is the sort of side of you know moral outrage and, well, I guess both religious moral outrage and, I guess, schizoid ignorance that seems to conflate every single conspiracy theory with Masonry itself, or somehow tie back to there, with very little nuance in where it actually comes from, what it is, how it exist then and now. and I'd hope to, I guess, elucidate a little bit into it. Um, in terms of accessible books, I usually I strongly recommend The Craft by John Dickey. It's an excellent sort of general history of masonry, how it developed throughout various countries. Um, when I first got started with masonry, Freemasons for Dummies by Christopher Hodap is an excellent one. It's very fair, and I've met Hodap a few times IRL, but that's neither here nor there. In terms of the schizoid stuff, I have on my bookshelf The History of Freemasonry by Albert Mackey. Albert Mackey was the mentor of the notorious Albert Pike. And in this tome, Mackey basically says, are the Masons descended from X? And he says in like 20 pages, no. Are the Masons descended from Y? 20 pages of no. And, goes on for 1,000 pages. So I'd hope to, clarify what it is and what it looked like in the colonial era.
Can
Um,
I just interject
sure.
briefly there? I'm glad you mentioned that because part of my preparation for this video was to read James Anderson's Constitutions of Freemasonry. Now, no doubt, lots of it's over my head because it's my first delve into Freemasonry, but he does connect Freemasonry to virtually everything in ancient and classical history. And you're
So,
suggesting that is not accurate, right?
well, so the Anderson Constitution actually got, I would say, retconned in Masonic history. It's the Anderson Constitution is like between 1717 and 1723 ish. There was, and then in 1738 ish, there's just this massive sort of formation process that is not documented at all. Internal power struggles and coups politically between various Jacobite and Whig factions, and I can get into the history a little bit, but yes, the fashion of the day was if you are going to have a royal society that everybody is going to, gather around, it has to, be the most ancient and the most noble and the most exclusive and the most biblically and pagan sanctioned thing of all time. Blessed by both God and Odin or whatever. Um, but that's I can get into sort of early development and how I guess the Anderson Constitution came along, just as a little bit of a preface, if you
Well,
don't
hey,
mind.
yeah.
Sure.
Well, how about very first of all, just tell us in the simplest way you can, what is Freemasonry?
So Freemasonry is a secret society fraternity built around the general improvement of men within the fraternity. Um, I guess that's a sort of just elevator pitch. It's a fraternity. It's the oldest. It's the biggest. It has some of the deepest pockets and the widest networking aspects. Um, it's accessible to the average man nowadays, and uh, when you first dip your toes into it, it can either be you know um, an esoteric, construction worker meeting, or it could be sort of like baby's first alchemy if you want to get into it, depending on how you want to interpret it. Um, in terms of this, how it is structurally, um, there are three sort of initiatory degrees: entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason. These three initiatory degrees make up what is called craft or blue lodges, where you first get initiated. These lodges belong to a grand lodge that sort of oversees and charters them. Um, initially, these were operative guilds, old medieval stonemason guilds, but over time they transitioned into what's called speculative masonry, where these are fraternal organizations built around yes, internal improvement, general betterment of your community and fellow members. Um, the I guess a tool of civic engagement, a tool of networking, and um, stuff like that. Um, so that's what masonry is at the heart of it.
Okay, then I
Um,
actually have a
sure.
question there about relating to the origins. The gentleman came into the organization and created speculative masonry, but what I I don't understand in that story is that there were many craft guilds, right? So there were carpenters' craft guilds and butchers' craft guilds. Why did the gentleman choose masonry, and why did we end up with Freemasonry and not free carpentry?
So this is sort of like what's built into, I guess, the sort of bones of architecture a as a as an actual occupation. So dating back all the way to like the 10th century, we have what's called the old charges, um, which is, King Athelstan proclaims that there is going to be stonemasons in his kingdom, and they shall venerate, Euclid and sacred geometry in their good works in in the creation of like cathedrals and castles and stuff like that. Um, and there are sort of like there's the Regis poem, from roughly like the 15 or like the 1400s that sort of venerates the ethics of being a sort of good construction worker, paying your workers fairly, having good manners, being able to travel place to place in a ordered and sort of I guess conscientious manner. Um, the reason why you have like the skull, or I'm sorry, the the skull and crossbones comes in a little bit later, but the reason why you have the square and compass with a G in the center, the G, you know, stands for like sacred geometry or God, um, with the it's the compass representing how you must circumscribe your actions within the broader society. So the moral limitations of what you can do as a good construction worker, and then a square for giving a square deal to the men that you interact with. Um, and eventually, during the sort of Scottish Reformation and the Scottish Enlightenment, or I'm sorry, the Scottish Renaissance, you end up with a sort of um, Renaissance man, various Renaissance men that take to heart the sort of lesson that to be a well-rounded individual, you need to have a certain appreciation for sacred geometry, the arts, and the useful sciences, as it applies from theoretical to actual use IRL. So what you had during the reign of James the Sixth of Scotland was he had a master of works named William Shaw, um, as well as other people in his court, like was it like Alexander de Song, early sort of Hermeticists who um, sort of organized these sort of crude medieval operative stonemason guilds into a formally governed structure with various lodges overseen by the general warden Shaw, and sort of said, "Hey, if you guys, we're not medieval anymore. We have regular monthly meetings. We meet, the sort of governing bodies meet, the 27th of December, St. John the Evangelist Day every year. We're going to actually formalize this thing for the betterment of Scotland and to build much nicer cathedrals in a much more efficient way." And you had all sorts of uh, occulty Renaissance guys who took both an interest in the sort of speculative, philosophical ends of sacred geometry. So eventually, what you had was um, these sort of stonemason guilds who have these sort of holdover medieval initiatory rites build buildings like the Royal Chapel in like Stirling and stuff like that. Um, but then there's the Great Fire of London of 1666, and these sort of formal lodges end up having to like most of London just burns down, right? So all these sort of Scottish stonemasons, um, they're called free and accepted masons because they're free men who can travel from town to town, and they're accepted by the general warden, um, as a sort of like business card, like, hey, we're actually part of the union. Um, but these stonemasons from Scotland end up setting up. Um, it's like I forget what it's called. It's like the London Company of Masons, and in under the construction of or under the supervision of Sir Christopher Yen, you end up with like the construction of like St. Paul's Cathedral and a ton of other like great buildings around London, like the Royal Navy Hospital and Greenwich and Blenheim Palace and like the Churchill family's like Oxfordshire seat. And um, what you have are these um, sort of well-off Renaissance man naturalists who start intermingling with these sort of esoteric stonemason guild types in these civic projects. Um, like it's sort of like if I don't know if like it's sort of like if Da Vinci started attending like Michelangelo's like construction meetings, and they're all like, well, this could be done better here, this could be done better there. Um, but at the same time, there's a certain amount of religious turmoil, with the English Civil War, and these sort of naturalists needed a sort of third place where they can all be kind of seen together. Protestants and Catholics wanted a nice sort of middle way to discuss civic matters publicly with the sort of excuse that this is public business. So that's how this sort of speculative masonry started coming along, just as a sort of civic engagement third place for Renaissance men. Um,
So I'd like to ask one more question there before we
sure.
move to America, and that is, you mentioned earlier the Anglo-Saxon connection, but now it seems very Scottish. So is Freemasonry, speaking as an Englishman, is it a Scottish import?
So yes, it is a Scottish import. Like there's no way around it. Like there's of course the Templar mythos, which that's a whole other rabbit hole. But what happened was in 1717 at the Goose and Gridiron, uh, the Anglos, the English set up the Grand or the Premier Grand Lodge of England, and between 1717 and the 1730s, essentially the sort of Whiggish, like Royal Society and like Whig politician types started retconning Masonic history to sort of blot out the esoteric and the Scottish elements of it. So you end up with like the Anderson Constitution being like retconned with the
Who was Scottish, by the way. So he
yeah.
retcons his own country out of the story.
No. The Anderson Constitution gets retconned
Oh.
out of the out of Scottish history by the 1738 edition of the Constitution, and there are of course other, I guess, like these are like somewhat well organized, like there's not just the English one, but the Premier Grand Lodge of England is the one that really takes off and has the most prestige and the most number of sort of people behind it. Like you have like what is his name? It's like John Dinglars or whatever his name was. Um, he was a member of the Royal Society, and he recruited a ton of Whigs. Like he initiated the Prime Minister Robert Walpole, and like the Duke of Montague to join the Premier Grand Lodge, and kind of made those lodges into sort of like Whig shadow government.
And that
Like,
sorry, that chap you
yeah,
mentioned doing the recruiting, he's French, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
um,
John.
I I need to look this
No
up.
problem, no problem. I recognize the name from the reading I was doing on early Masonic history, and I believe he was a French Protestant.
Yeah,
Um,
I need to look this up real quick.
which is very interesting to me to see how from this stage, from when
Yes,
uh,
he was
ma-
French.
very international. I mean, I know today with English and Scottish we can allied as British, but still, it's multi-ethnic very early on.
Well, that comes a little bit later
Okay.
because what happens is that the sort of second Grandmaster of Masonry, the Duke of Wharton, um, he's a sort of Jacobite, and he creates the first Hellfire Club. He's a rake. He does all sorts of naughty, like actually kind of naughty stuff that he probably shouldn't have. Um, and he starts, I guess, he's such a sort of disgrace that him and a ton of other like Scots end up sort of getting canceled and getting kicked out of the Premier Grand Lodge, and you have this sort of pristine Whig takeover, but at the same time, there's the Grand Lodge of Ireland getting set up in 1725, Grand Lodge of Scotland in 1736 ish, and then there are a bunch of other like Grand Lodges of England that are sort of like the Timu versions of the Premier. But what you end up with is what you end up with is the sort of split between what are called the moderns of the Premier and the ancients of the Grand Lodges of Ireland, Scotland, and what's later the ancient Grand Lodge of England. And the moderns are the sort of the ones based around like London. They're sort of old Whig elite. Um, they cut giant sections out of the Anderson Constitution. They retcon the history. They simplified the degree work and make and sort of make different innovations that a lot of older, sort of more stodgy traditional types didn't really approve of. Like they're like, okay, we want to be a little bit esoteric, but you keep on cutting this stuff out, and you keep on lowering membership standards. Like we want to do the whole like hour-long monologue thing in our degrees. Um, but there's certain cost to this, where even in like the 17 or in the 1860s, there I forget who it was. It was our French gentleman who said that there were, quote, 1,000 ridiculous postures and grimaces in operation. So part of the Premier's goal was just to standardize things, but at the same time, they sort of uh, alienated a lot of the sort of old hardliners. And at the same time, they wouldn't accept sort of Irish noblemen into their fraternity. Even though they were very well off Irish aristocrats, they still wouldn't accept them as their brethren. They wouldn't give like charity to them whenever they wouldn't give charity to Irish Mason widows, stuff like that. Um, and so there was this sort of internal schism, and along with the schism, there was also, of course, the Jacobite rebellion, and you end up with a ton of Scottish um, sort of Scottish Masons who fled to France, and you end up with like the first like lodge, like Scottish lodge in France in like 1726 ish. But what really like kicks off French Masonry is this one speech delivered in 17 was it 36 ish by Chevalier Charles Ramsay, the tutor of Bonnie Prince Charlie in exile. And what Ramsay does is he says, Freemasonry is descended from the Knights Templar. Um, Basically, the conspiracy theory is that like we all like in sort of recognized history, what happened to the Knights Templar was that um, French king didn't want to pay his debts to this international knightly order that failed to protect the Holy Land, and so he trumped up charges of occultism and had them all burned to the stake. But Chevalier Ramsay's assertion was that a lot of these Templars fled to Scotland and aided Robert the Bruce in fending off the English and created sort of these esoteric for this esoteric fraternal organization that became the Freemasons. Um, Now, the actual historicity of this is, you know, I don't personally buy into it, but a lot of French people did, and these sort of poor, um, these sort of poor, um, exiled Scots, Jacobites in France, essentially fabricated a bunch of esoteric degrees and sold them at like a nice profit to these French aristocrats, and it was a quick way to raise a ton of money. And by the end of the 1700s, there were like 1,000 different degrees and 36 different grand lodges, and like tens of like between like 30 and 100,000 Masons in France by the time of the French Revolution. Um, so you have all these different elements of claims to authority, trying to standardize things, but at the same time, the Scottish and ancients and Irish and French are all trying to create all these weird occulty, templary kind of new degrees. So you start with just 3 degrees, and you end up with like you end up with 33 really by end of things. Um, But that's nothing to say anything about like the colonial aspect of this. All these divisions carried over into colonial America, of course.
Yeah, that was a fascinating overview. I really thank you for that. And what I want to know actually is how early did it go to America?
So, technically, the first so some Masons in Massachusetts put they petitioned for a warrant. They petitioned for a charter. All the way back then, 1721. Technically, it was brought over by 33 and actually chartered in Boston in 34-ish. But according to Benjamin Franklin, several lodges were already in operation were actually in operation in Philadelphia in 1730, and they were Franklin was the Grand Master of Pennsylvania in 1734-ish. So the I personally believe that the Pennsylvanians were the first, but Massachusetts is technically the first. So this is 1720s, 1730s ish. Like the French and Spanish colonies wouldn't have their lodges until like the 1740s through 60s ish.
The in Massachusetts and other colonies, was there craft masonry before the 18th century?
Um, not not really. They didn't really carry over these sort of medieval guilds. Um, like you have to realize like places like Virginia were basically company towns, and they didn't have like heavy industry or organized guilds. They didn't really have anything like that in the colonies. Um, but what Masonry did do was it functioned as a good quote I found was as a neighborhood benefit society. Um, like, have you ever heard of the Leather Apron Club? I know he's got a big YouTube channel
Yeah,
somewhere.
yes, I have.
Yeah, so that was actually a sort of Freemason knockoff club, founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1727, I think. Um, basically, it was all the sort of civic organizers of Philadelphia who were, all politically aligned as Whigs, of course. Um, they got together, pooled resources and their brains, and they organized. You know, they set up the very first like public library in the colonies, and they set up the sewage system. They coordinated between themselves the firemen's brigade, and that's what the society like those sorts of societies functioned as. They're know semi-secretive, rotary clubs, stuff like that, and that's how these functioned essentially. And there's a sort of class division too. Um, like I said kind of earlier, like the moderns, like the Premier Grand Lodge of England, these are the sort of wealthy like Anglos, as opposed to, I guess, some of the more, I guess, Scots and Scottish, Irish, northern, like Yorkshire type of like a little bit less well off individuals joined like the various ancients lodges. And this can be actually seen like in the various Massachusetts lodges. Like the very first lodge in Massachusetts was St. John's, and like, do you know who Governor Thomas Hutchinson was?
I do not know who that was.
So during the early era of like the American Revolution, um, Hutchinson was the governor of Massachusetts during like the Boston Tea Party and the battles of Lexington and Concord, and he wrote to the king to request aid to stamp out the rebellion. He's a loyalist and he's a Mason in this sort of well-off moderns lodge. But also in that same lodge was like John Otis and a few other like sort of moderate patriots. Uh, Meanwhile, the ancients they had St. Andrew's Lodge, which you know can you imagine like the sort of lower class? Well, all these guys meet at taverns, but the St. Andrew's ancients met at the side of the Green Tree Tavern, which the very same tavern that is conveniently the meeting place of the Sons of Liberty that organized the Boston Tea Party, and conveniently had almost the exact same membership, and also included like John Hancock, the very first president of the U.S. Congress, and Paul Revere and Joseph Warren, and all of these sort of hardline, and like Sam Adams, and all these hardline pro-revolution patriots. So there's a
And
sort
they
of
are
class.
relatively
Yeah,
lower down the social scale. I mean, we're not talking like laboring
yeah,
men here,
like
but
these.
relatively lower down.
Yeah, like Paul Revere, he is a sort of political propagandist, and like he owns a print shop, and like Joseph Warren is a doctor, and John
Mm.
Hancock is like a wealthy smuggler. So like these aren't like poor guys. These are just not like the governor's man, and not like the highest echelons of society. So there's
Well,
like a little bit of
I
a
actually,
class. Yeah.
yeah, sorry, I actually found some data on the
Hmm.
membership of these lodges yesterday on an article on JSTOR, and just to take one demographic as comparison, the Boston Modern Masons between 68 and 70, they had 9 sea captains, Well, the St Andrew's Lodge, they had 44.
Hmm.
And it's similar if you compare other lower level. So take a higher level profession, merchants, Boston Moderns, 64 merchants, 66% of their membership. Whereas the St Andrew's Lodge, only 32, 26% of their membership.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Um, and that's sort of like the breakdown of like the sort of New England and I guess like the New England and middle colonies um sort of breakdown. That there it's a little bit different in the South, and it's a lot different in like the Caribbean, which tend to be, I guess, a lot more like the Caribbean is a lot more elitist in the first place. Um, and in the South, it's I guess a little bit different. Um, like in like stereotypically, like in the North, a lot of the times they meet in like taverns that have like the upstairs of like tavern rooms where they can, lock doors and stuff like that and meet. In the South, a lot of the times they use like planters' great houses and stuff like that as their meeting rooms. So you have to. These are like, these are the social circles, and you actually have to know the guys that you're brothers with in the fraternity very, very well, um, to actually get a foot
How,
in the door.
how important was this? How important was Freemasonry overall to leadership in the American colonies? Like,
Well,
if
like.
you wanted, go on.
Mhm. Well, like I said, like with like the Leather Apron Club, these were the guys that set up the library and set up the fire department and set up like the sewage system. Like in Boston, these were just about all of like the movers and shakers. They went to the same lodges together. They hang out. They drank together. They chatted politics and business after hours. Um, and it's the sort of sidle glue that held everything together, um, I, across generally somewhat across class boundaries, but definitely across like religious boundaries. Like these were the sort of social networks that just bounded sort of the male societies together in these areas. Um,
Well, and one can imagine how useful that would be in a colonial setting where you've got so many different
y-
sub-ethnic groups of the British Isles and the different religions. Of course,
yeah,
Protestant dissenters, Anglicans, and of course even Catholics. Actually, I wanted to ask: could Quakers join the Freemasons?
Quakers did not. Like they are strictly against swearing oaths.
Right.
Yeah.
I just could have sworn I saw a reference to not the original Penn, but a later member of the family
Well,
being at the time of the Revolution being a Freemason. But maybe he wasn't a Quaker anymore. I don't
well,
know.
the thing about William Penn is that he was a fervent Quaker, but as soon as he died, all of his sons and I think two of his daughters converted back to Anglicanism.
So
So,
many cases in Quaker
yeah.
history of that.
So,
Like the Roundtree family are like that as well in the UK. I think it's around they were Quakers, and then once they're super rich from selling candy and chocolate, they've got full set of household staff and stuff like that, and living like
yeah.
upper class Englishmen.
Like and also just the sort of societal function. Like being a brother of a lodge was something like it's it's something like a professional recommendation to your good character. Like if you're a well regarded guy amongst other guys at a lodge, then what does that say about how sociable and upstanding of a person you are? Um, and during the American Revolution, like George Washington, he was so sort of uh, he was so inundated with so many sort of French dilettantes with generalship commissions that he was just like, you know, guys, the you have to give me some sort of qualification for these officers, and one of the qualifications was that they had to be Masons, or that would help for Washington to actually accept them. Like, um, like he like a ton of like the early sort of French generals, like there's like Coldray and Plessis and Conway, like they like i- he wanted some sort of means of vetting people, and that's how you ended up with like Lafayette and von Steuben coming over. And during the American Revolution, like one of the big sort of fundraising means was well, fundraising and vetting means was using the Parisian lodge, the Nine Sisters, Neuf Sœurs, which was a fascinating place. It was this salon owned by this wealthy French cat lady that functioned as a sort of American revolutionary like fraternal lodge, and you ended up with like Benjamin Franklin recruiting guys like John Paul Jones and von Steuben to the American effort through there. But also, yeah, yep.
This is absolutely fascinating how it's being used to connect across the Atlantic. But it seems to me, from the point of view of English Freemasons, that it's making connections across the Atlantic in the wrong way. So
Well,
you've explained how it was useful for connecting the elites within America. Why isn't it connecting America to England if they both if the elites in both places have Freemasonry and Britain is the home of Freemasonry? Why didn't it work that way?
so I would say that it works something on the sort of contrary. I would say that it bound uh, like the complete opposite case is like Canada. Um, a much higher proportion of the Canadian founding fathers were Masons than the American Constitutional and Declaration of Independence founding fathers. Um, on the I think it's Masonry is something more of a social accelerant than an actual force in of itself. Um, where if you have a bunch of guys who are, you know, politically like-minded and they belong to the same fraternity, they start working within that fraternity, but it works both ways in certain instances. Um, and like I said, like Masonry wasn't, unified, and it never really has been. You had your Whiggish types, you had your sort of high Tory types, you had your Jacobite types, and you had your foreign types, and they were all none of them really none of these sort of groups interacted with each other too much. Um like Hutchinson, who's the governor of Massachusetts, his correspondence to the king was opened and exposed publicly by Benjamin Franklin, another Mason, who was a member of the Hellfire Club, the Second Hellfire Club, which was also operated by Masons. But then he got shaken, you know, told off by various royal advisors who are also Masons. So I think it's just the societal air that the sort of movers and shakers breathed at the time than a one-way ideological direction.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and I think particularly, we said at the beginning of the video that there's a lot of sensationalist or, as you said, schizoid takes on Freemasonry. But it seems hard to envision a Freemason world conspiracy if these Freemasons are actually behaving based on their own political inclinations or of their national set or class in different locations.
Y- yes, and it's very it's not particularly unified, but if you're a sort of fellow traveler and you're going from one country to another, or even from like one state to another, you can be somewhat recognized. Um, and you, I think it was Rudyard Kipling who said that you can go from lodge to lodge, country to country, and the sort of ritual kind of rhymes, and it's never quite the same, but it always kind of rhymes. It hits the same beats. And traveling from lodge to lodge in the U.S., they the actual lodge meetings and ritual stuff, it does vary a ton, even within the U.S. Between states. Between dress code, what you actually do, what is said, how things are done, but all kind of rhymes. Um,
Is there any kind of numbers available for like what proportion of the colonial leadership was Masons?
um, I don't actually have any hard data. I do have sort of um, I do have some data on how many lodges there were in England. Like, start out with from the Premier Grand Lodge. Start out with 4, but by 1738 there were 106 across country, or maybe about 150-ish.
Well, how many people
Um,
in an average lodge at that time then?
it's a I think the proportion is about 40
Okay,
to about 40 to 80 ish. Like 80 would be massive, but I'd say about 40 to 50.
right.
Um, so I just have to extrapolate on that. Uh, During this sort of later period, though, there were about 500 across the Americas, or across the 13 colonies ish, give or take. But at the same time, there are these. There are both these sort of settled lodges that are based out of towns, but there are also what are called traveling lodges, where like a military regiment is the guys of a regiment decide to form their own lodge, uh, often officered by their officers. Um, and apparently, during the late 1700s, there are about 500 of these traveling lodges as well across the UK, or across the British Empire. So there are a lot of these static lodges. There are a ton of these traveling lodges. Like 90% of these traveling lodges are ancients. Uh, about like 60 to 70% of the sort of settled ones in America are modern, but 30 to 40 are ancient-ish. I the numbers are not very easy to figure out because the ancients were very schizophrenic in their recording. Like, sometimes they'd use one name for a lodge and then it goes defunct, so we'll rename another lodge to that old name, just to keep just to make sure that we don't lose track of or um we don't really keep on tallying up the numbers too much. Like lodge number 5 went defunct. Let's name lodge 500 back to 5 and make our historians very confused as to why the lodge in Yorkshire is now in Jamaica. Let's make the let's make our historians very confused. Um, so it's very hard to figure out. But uh, by 1813, there's the Union, where the ancients moderns kind of settled their differences, conveniently both represented by English princes. And the ancients moderns kind of mended their differences
How
and
did they manage
unified them.
that in the middle of war with the UK, with Britain?
So
That's amazing in and of itself.
So Prince Augustus Frederick, the Duke of Sussex, represented the moderns, and Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, represented the ancients, and they, kind of compromised on like ritual. They were like, okay, moderns, you can't just delete all of the boring parts, but moderns, you have to actually accept the secret fourth degree, uh, as as a compromise, and they kind of ironed out their differences, and the rest is history. It's one big sort of Anglo affiliated. Uh, well, it's one big Anglophile, uh, Anglophone world. Across the world, though, the French lodges, they mostly are chartered through the Grand Orient of France, though, across continental Europe, and that's a sort of whole other beast. We also
Uh,
get like the Scotch right out of there.
Sorry, if I can just dwell on the 1813 reconciliation, did they physically meet to do this? The reason it's amazing to me is because Britain and America were at war at the time.
Yeah, yes, a lot of these nobles did kind of meet. It did take forever though. It took years, and
Okay.
I believe like the ancient secretary just didn't forward like some of the mail like updates from the meetings to the other Grand Lodge officers, just to keep stalling the process even more. Um, but yeah, it did take a while, but it's now one big unified Anglo world. Um, Although in America, about 99% of the lodges are Anglo, or it's called the York Rite in America, but there are only, I think, either like 10 or 12 what are called red lodges that are sanctioned by France, essentially, by the Scottish Rite in the U.S. Um, Now, the Scottish Rite is a whole different, like, it's a fascinating beast. Like, it's an American invention that comes from Haiti, essentially, and it's where a lot of like schizo conspiracies come from. Um,
Okay. So maybe that would get ahead. That's late in the 19th century, though, right? And if I understand that correctly.
no, actually,
Um,
that comes from
oh,
like 1761 ish.
oh, beg your pardon. So that was just before. So just before the revolution. I mean, was that relevant to the revolution at all?
Not particularly. This one French merchant named Stephen Morin brought the sort of Templar kind of esoteric Hermetic degrees that were, you know, all the rage in France to Haiti and Jamaica in '61, and created the Rite of Perfection, which are like 25 degrees, then exported those to New York City and Charleston. Um, and after the Haitian Revolution, all of these sort of French Masons ended up going to Charleston, and you know, a few of them ended up uh, forming what are called the 11 Gentlemen of Charleston, and they founded the modern day Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. Although it remained very sort of niche up until the 18 to like I guess the mid 1800s, when it really popped off, especially in the South. It pretty much died, or it was very very small and niche in the North, like up until you know up until the late 1800s.
Okay, look, we've touched on it a little bit. You mentioned Washington's using Freemasonry to vet French officers, and you mentioned how some important figures in the revolution were Freemasons. But taken as a whole, how important was Freemasonry to the American Revolution?
Oh, it was very, I guess, important to create these sort of initial sort of Sons of Liberty networking opportunities. Um, it was very important to create these sort of social networks to get these things off the ground. It's like, okay, uh, I'm a a pro, and I'm a patriot in Boston. Do you know any guys in New York, or do you know any guys in Virginia? They're like, well, try the lodge. They seem to lean one way politically, and that's how the sort of correspondence was created initially. Um, and then there's the sort of organizational aspect, um, where Sons of Liberty and um, all these early networks got off the ground, you know, organized in the very same building as a lot of these lodges, like like the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania today is trying to rebuild the Tun Tavern. The Tun Tavern was where the very first Pennsylvania lodge was founded in 1730s, but was also where the United States Marine Corps was founded, and where we had some of our first like U.S. Navy recruiting stations. Um, so these were sort of networking hubs that functioned as what no, they were networking hubs essentially. That's what they were.
Yes, that's fascinating to me in another way because in the time of England's revolutions and civil wars in the 17th century, of course, you also needed to find people who thought the same way as you, and what that led to was a sort of alignment, not perfect alignment, between religion and politics. So it's the churches, because the church is where you can go meet people and you can find people with similar ideas to you and talk to people privately. So church served that. The different churches served that function. It seems to me that Freemasonry is then taking that function in America. It just surprises me actually that the different churches which America had, didn't serve that function in the revolution, or maybe they did in ways that I don't know. What do you
Well,
think?
they
What do you think about
they
that?
they somewhat did, but these this was just another, I guess, another form of social life. I guess just a different type of society, like it's a different avenue for society. Um, on the sort of religious angle, though, are you familiar with the Loyal Orange Order, or like the Orangemen of like Ulster?
Of course, yes, of course. And if I'm correct, I believe they were at least inspired by the Masons. Is that true?
Yes. So they're formed like in 1795-ish, um, as a sort of like Protestant Freemason gang to fight off like Irish bandits, and eventually, help put down the United Irishmen, um, which are the Catholic fraternal organization. Um, in America, the Orangemen are still around today. Like we're actually we're small but very secretive. And the degrees of the Orangemen are actually very, very similar to Craft Mason degrees, plus some additional stuff about not marrying a Catholic. Um, but one of the sort of strange things that I came across in real life was, have you ever heard of the Fenian raids?
Into Canada, yes, of course. They
Yeah.
had the Irish American Civil War veterans attacking British Canada, hoping to hold it hostage to acquire Irish independence from Britain.
Yeah, like 1866 and 70, the proto IRA thought, hey, how do we free Ireland? Well, we take Canada and then we bargain it for a free Ireland. Um, but
Bonkers.
the thing is, a lot of the Canadian militia defense forces that fended off these proto IRA rebels were themselves Orangemen. The Orangemen were the vanguard against the raids. You know, was it 70-ish years after the rebellion of was it 1798 or whatever? Like these things kept on going, and even in America, like a few of these sort of York Rite, like Knights Templar kind of commander of Knights Templar organizations created sort of nativist sort of fraternal orders against against more sectarian elements and sectarian Catholic immigrants later on in like the 1800s. But that's a little bit outside the boundary of I guess what we're going for.
Sure, but it's still important to know the direction these things are going. So you're saying that parts of Masonry did evolve in a patriotic American direction, and
Um,
I've certainly found that
mhm.
for Britain in some of the research I've done, some of the articles I've read.
Yes, that's very true. Um, and I guess it was something like America's sort of civic religion, um, especially in the early republic, up until the what was called the Morgan Affair, which ground masonry in America to sort of grinding halt for a little while.
So yes, I'm a little bit familiar with that, but I'm sure you'll know more. it was a former Mason who wanted to reveal Masonic secrets and was then probably murdered, or at least disappeared, right? So assumed murdered.
Yeah, so William Morgan, he was a sort of failed businessman in upstate New York. Um, he wanted to, so he's this, generally kind of scummy guy, failed entrepreneur, and he wanted um, to essentially make money in like the one way he knew how, and that was I'm going to publish, the transcripts for actually doing Masonic degrees, and I'll make a lot of money. And what happened was he was probably kidnapped, and the last anyone saw of him, he was, stuck in a carriage and being, disappeared, and nobody really knows what happened to him after that.
Well, that's perfect
Um,
fuel for the sensationalist schizoid view of Freemasonry, isn't it?
so So where what happened was about a few months later, this one decomposed body washed up on Lake Ontario, and it looked like some sort of like Masonic, like penalty for violating one's oaths um, kind of ritual murder. Um, it was revealed later that it wasn't actually Morgan, but this was like fuel for the sort of schizo bait. Um, and there were all sorts of like sort of county level like corruption scandals where Masons would sort of corruptly, do favoritism to brothers of lodges. So there's sort of democratic impulse to fight nepotism among fraternities in the U.S. And there's also the sort of evangelical concept of like, hey, you guys can't swear oaths or whatever. Um, so that's where that was where sort of Masonry took a downturn in America. Um,
Okay, yes, I want to get back to something you said about it being America's civil religion up to this point, right? I want to talk for a moment about the relationship between Freemasonry, at least in this, particularly in this era that we're talking about, so colonial America, early republic, and religion, because it strikes me that there is some surprising things. I read about one guy called Stukely. I forget his first name, but he's in England. He's not American, but he had a he had a backyard druidic shrine, and he even buried one of his miscarried children there. And this seems to me like it should have been scandalous at the time. Maybe not. Maybe the average person didn't know about it. But even accepting 18th century religious fervor had calmed down compared to the 17th century, it looks like, from the outsider's point of view, these people are engaging in odd, unorthodox practices that could definitely look religious. So, I mean, I could ask you a simple question: is Freemasonry a religion? And if not, why not? And in what way is it not?
I mean, it's not, well, it's explicitly in its various degrees kind of states that it is not a religion or a substitute for a religion. It's just a fraternity. It's a secret society with initiatory degrees. It doesn't really make any statement um, about religion insofar as we're gonna break bread together and be tolerant of each other within the fraternity. So it doesn't really make any sort of explicit uh, theological claims. Um, a lot of sort of higher degrees do actually start touching on more esoteric subjects that are, it's distasteful. I guess more hermetic for the Scottish Rite degrees, and on the other hand, some degrees are a little bit more Christian. Like in the U.S., we have um, the Royal Arch, Cryptic, and Commandery degrees. Commandery requiring that you are a practicing Christian. Um, like these are sort of morality tales for men who wish to better themselves and their communities. and the degrees are allegorical and somewhat pseudo historical. So I don't. I've never really found there to be. It's not really a subject in and of it. It's not really a substitute for religion in and of itself. It's not saying that you go to a lodge every month instead of going to church every week. Um, but I meant it as a civic religion insofar as new government buildings had uh, there's a certain little ritual of pouring oil and corn into the cobblestone of a new government building, stuff like that. And
Thing
then
is,
yeah,
sorry, but for a lot of people, that's as far as religion ever goes. Most religious people, a lot of religious people, don't have deep theological ideas, right? They're not theologians. Their main thing is meeting people and ceremony. The ceremony is very important to a lot of people. At least this is this is a very big part of my experience of religion. Anyway, I mean, you can share your experience if you like, but it seems to me that Freemasonry has a lot of that in it. You meet regularly and you do ceremony together.
I mean it's I'm actually a member of various professional societies and clubs that are not Masonic in nature, and we meet up every month, and it's not a particular problem that you know my various professional societies don't have prohibitions on different religions, men of different religions attending them. I don't particularly see the sort of religious angle coming in from here. Um, I do see all sorts of objections on the like how the actual content of craft mason degrees themselves that some people take objection to. Um, and there's the aspect of swearing oaths, which I've never felt to be particularly compelling. You know, if you actually just read, listen to what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, I don't think he's talking about whether you can swear to join a fraternity. I I don't I don't really see the objection. It is what I'm trying to say.
All right, yeah, I think that's a fair answer. Uh, all right, I think that is been absolutely fascinating. Is there any other points you want to make about Freemasonry, or are we close to wrapping this up? What do you think?
Let me see. I would like to say that things do actually get rather crazy in the 1800s and early 1900s with I guess the spiritualist movement, where you end up with a whole lot of woo woo, like quote unquote higher level degrees. It's fun, but it's probably a different aspect. Um, I'd say that um, let's see. There are aspects of I guess colonial Caribbean colonies, which operated very similarly to the southern colonies in the United States, where you had planters and their various other planter friends invite each other to each other's houses to attend a lodge once a month. Uh,
Actually,
mhm.
that reminds me of something fascinating about the Caribbean. Earlier in the Caribbean history, 17th century, they were very keen on avoiding partisan disputes. So that they in Barbados in the mid 17th century, they had this habit, this tradition that if in anger you use the word roundhead or Puritan or Cavalier, that you had to then treat all your friends to a roast pig and loads of drinks. So it's that seems like a people who might appreciate Freemasonry based on what you've told me.
Well, a lot from what I've read, it seems like the Caribbean lodges tended to be a lot more about, I guess, men of similar businesses talking shop about commerce, and the sort of colonial American 13 colonies ones ended up being a lot more about civic engagement and ended up being a lot more partisan as opposed to commercial.
That's not
It does make
surprising. I
sense.
mean, a lot of people in the Caribbean, they didn't stick it out for a long time, right? They go there, they make their money, they go home before they die of disease.
Yeah, and there's also oh the sort of aspect of like the traveling military lodges where we have you ever heard of the Prince Hall Masons?
I do not know the Prince Hall Masons. What's
Okay,
that?
so in 1775, a traveling Irish regiment stationed in Boston initiated 15 black gentlemen who um, were rejected from the regular lodges in the colonies, but they were uh, kind of not really, but kind of allowed to form a lodge on their own. You know, African Lodge Number One um, in the colonies. Although no one actually recognized them in the U.S. for like 200 years, and the Brits kind of acknowledged them even though they were improperly, set up, just despite the Americans. So you end up with the sort of black British aligned, like sort of separate spin-off organization that ended up with a ton of sort of black abolitionists and corrupt Reconstruction era politicians, being a part of this particular fraternity. And President Joe Biden was made a Prince Hall Mason or honorary one about a year ago. So
Oh, he's the first. He must have become the first black president then, huh?
yes, um, but that's a sort of different digression though. Um, but there's a whole lot of history here, and I really went through the sort of general points of the sort of schizophrenic history of early Masonry, and I hope I elucidated a little bit on what it was actually like back then in the
Yes, I
various
think you
sort of
did,
part.
and I think that's very important to note. Like, not to just see these things as faceless institutions, but what it's like for the actual people doing it, right? And I think you did give some good impressions about that, so I really appreciate that.
um, I might actually hold on. I'm gonna actually leave you off with a fairly decent impression of what it actually looked like. Um, are you familiar with the artist William Hobarth?
Yes, of course. He's a Mason too, right? British 18th century artist.
Y- yes, I'm trying to find it. Um, aha. Okay, here we go. I'm gonna send this to you on Twitter real quick.
Okay, and then I save it and then share it. Yes.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Hang on. You can't share images on this, can you not? Because you're not host. Is that true?
Actually, I think I can.
If you
As,
can, do it that way because I have some issues I mentioned before with the chat function on X.
Sure. I'll just pull this up.
Like, it does not reliably load for me. I'm not sure about that, why that is, but if you can share the image here, then do
Uh,
so.
I got it.
Oh yeah, I see it. I can select it now. I can add to
All
stage.
right. Hell yeah. So this is Hogarth's painting Night, and it's a collection of 4 paintings throughout the day, and one of the you know, this shows a very decrepit scene of a London street, and someone's dumping their waste. You have people yelling at each other. Someone's getting like their nose, or no, he's getting shaved, but he's getting cut a little bit. Um, there's some bums down here. Someone's smoking. Someone's blowing smoke into some baby's face, and in the corner you have the worshipful master, the sort of head of a lodge, um, in his full garb with his grand or worshipful master Jewel with his little apron, being guided down the street by drunk by the Tyler with the little mason sword, getting sewage dumped on him. And this is drunk as a mason was sort of ad as a sort of ism that people like to go by. They were a sort of partying fraternity that met in taverns to discuss philosophy, natural science, and civic engagement. And then after a meeting, they would go down to the tavern itself, have a few too many drinks, then stumble home. And that was the original sort of buy-in to the organization, and that's somewhat how it still is to this very day. So I'd like to leave on this little comical scene, if you don't mind.
I think that's a perfect place to finish. All right. Thank you very much, Clossington. It has been fascinating, very interesting. I hope anyone watching this will check out your channel. I'll say thank you to Dissident Knight, who's stuck with us the whole time, making some good comments in the chat there. Do check out. I'm sure Dissident Knight already has, but anyone else who sees this video, check out Clossington's channel, or give him a follow. Follow my channel for more colonial and British Empire history. And thank you very much to everyone who's joined us today, and or later, indeed later. Thank you very much.